B from Killingworth, and you're listening to ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the River Valley, where we make local matter. And remember, don't miss the moments.
Hello, everybody. This is Scott Brady, and you're listening to Archaeology in Connecticut. This is a really special show for us. This is our 12th episode. Believe it or not, it's already been a year, and we thank you all for listening along with us here. And we're going to take a moment with Dan, and we were joined by special guests Sarah Sportman and Nick Bellantoni. We're going to discuss what our favorite moments of the past year are and where Connecticut archaeology is moving in the future. Dan, welcome aboard.
Thank you, Scott. So welcome back, everybody, to the show. And I think you'll understand shortly as we go through this episode why we're very excited and also why there's a particularly attractive symmetry to today's episode. So when the show was first created, when we were laying out the topics and Brian and Scott were working through what they wanted to talk about, this month's episode was already sort of laid out as a discussion of the state archaeologist position, the Office of the State Archaeologist. So we're going to talk a little bit about not just the past of that with our close friend Nick Bellantoni, but also about the coming future for that. But before we get into the state archaeologist stuff, we wanted to just sort of take a quick walk back, talk about some of our favorite moments, a couple of anecdotes from the sort of behind-the-scenes part of this show.
Before we jump into that, can we just let everybody know that if you want to participate, you can send in comments and questions into info@icrvradio.com. That's info@icrvradio.com. We have a few that have already queued up, so looking forward to getting to those. You can also go old school and use the telephone to actually make a phone call. You can do that at 860-526-ICRV. That's 860-526-4278. Also want to say and thank the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology for powering this series. So we're grateful and thankful to them and look forward to an extended relationship in the months to come.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David. So before we launch in, Scott, I'm going to put you on point and ask you just for the one sort of standout memory that you have from our first year of broadcast.
I think the thing that I'm amused by somewhat is, Brian was one of the smoothest talking guys I've ever met. And I wasn't here for the first episode. I had been away. And when I got back and sat down with him and he started to talk about it, he said, I don't know, it didn't. And I listened to it, and he was still good. But it wasn't, there was that spontaneousness that took a couple episodes to develop. And it was great to see him get into that role and really get comfortable being the mediator, basically, between all of us that sit here around the table.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And having re-listened to the very first episode, I was struck by a close friend who I knew very well, talking and immediately recognized his voice, but also you can tell it was a brand new experience. And having stepped in myself, I can certainly empathize with that. Yeah. But Brian really got his legs underneath him really quickly along with you. So the show really took off, after those first few episodes in particular. I'm going to share the sort of behind-the-scenes view here. So for our listeners, not shockingly, our guests are often here in the studio with us, as our guests today are, or they call in. And the dynamic is very different when we're hosting the show with callers on the phone, because there is no hand signaling between. You can't convey other messages other than by interrupting, which isn't easy for some of us. So we had a fantastic show actually with a good friend of all of ours, Kenny Fader, who is a very well-known archaeologist in Connecticut, and the guest on that episode was the other guest on that show was Meg Harper, who is also a fantastic archaeologist, but very reserved. Kenny is anything but. Kenny has a personality the size of Mount Rushmore, and of course, when we got Kenny going, he talked for 25 minutes. It was hard for any of us to get a word in, and it was great. But I look back on that and blame myself. Like, it was a very obvious after the fact that would have been a difficult combination of personalities on there. But it was amusing, and Meg took it in great stride when I teased her a little bit after the fact that she should have piped in earlier for that. But that's one of the ones that really sticks with me.
Yeah, and I think when Brian kind of came up with this format with the people here at ICRV Radio, one of the things that was really important to him was, and he said it many times, we need to make sure people understand this is science. Archaeology is science. It's not just stories getting made up and, digging stuff up. There's education and thoughts and theses and hypotheses behind it. And he didn't really want to and I don't say this derogatorily, but dumb it down to the point where we lose the fact that there's real science going on here. And I think that, in the shows that Brian let us in, and then once you got in here and took over, I think we've done a good job of trying to keep that balance of making it accessible to people, but also keeping the science in what we're doing here so that we are challenging people to learn along and get better and understand more about archaeology.
Yeah, and honestly, for many of us, it's a big challenge, right? Because we can nerd out about esoteric topics and drive people totally bonkers. Or, I can picture people's eyes glazing over when we get going. And we're very animated and passionate about this. But it's not always the easiest entry point to a discussion about the sort of broader topics. And so that is something we've tacked back and forth on from episode to episode. But again, we really thank the audience for sticking with us as we've kind of tried to sort out exactly what we want this show to be. And be able to continue bringing on really fantastic guests as well to engage in the discussion.
Absolutely.
Is it at all reflective of the types of conversations you will have when a studio and microphones aren't involved?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to watch a couple archaeologists to get together and pick up a projectile point and debate for the next 2.5 hours what the actual shape is and what it should be called. I mean, it's it's napped from this side, but I mean, it just gets, the minutia is incredible and we love it and we have a good time. And I think it makes everyone a better archaeologist. But as Brian had said, and as you have said, we can get in the weeds pretty quick.
Yeah, it's even better if you throw in a bottle of scotch.
Note to self. Hey, I don't know if you remember, there were a couple when we had members and authorities on First Nation and the tribal communities in and around our area. There was one episode where it was really masterful how you were able to navigate it, because it was quite clear that there's a little bit a different approach in terms of the science and the want to get down in the dirt, actually, between First Nation representatives and you guys. It was actually, you're chomping at the bit. You want to dig down and see what you can uncover. And I think the messaging coming from the tribal communities was there has to be a reason to disrupt this space, this earth. And I found that to be, it was a simple thing. It was just a little nuance, but it was fascinating.
Well, and this is a thing for people who have never engaged in archaeology or talked to archaeologists or understand the way it actually works in practice. This, relationship with, in particular, with Native Americans, indigenous communities, and for the archaeologists who work in researching ancient cultures, this is a complex relationship that has always existed. And it is evolving rapidly, but it is really powerful to hear the perspective from people who, this is not a simple comparison between sort of science and traditional ways of looking at the world. And in fact, I think for both James Quinn and Marissa Turnbull, our guests for that episode, they're remarkably capable in terms of communicating exactly why this is important, not just to them, but to a much broader range of indigenous communities.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think that was one of, for me, that was one of our most important episodes, that people understand that, not everybody has the same perspective on how our archaeology should be done and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah,
and who should be involved in it.
Right, and I think that's a critical question. And one of the things that I would hope in the future that I think is a really important topic for a lot of us is really trying to figure out how we all disagree gracefully because it's a really important topic, because there are differences of perspective, but it's not always easy to figure out how you even communicate those differences in a way that isn't immediately creating new conflicts and make future discussions even more complicated. So it's a great topic, and one that I hope we'll be able to explore in the future. But
it is the one thing that I would like to add to that, though, is I do think that here in Connecticut we've been fortunate that the non-native archaeologists have been very cognizant of making those efforts, and I think the outreach from the tribes has also been exceptional, and I think we are in a much better place than a lot of other states because of that effort to come together and see each other's points of view.
Yeah, and I think that's true, and I think that's probably been Nick's experience as well over the years. And you've done a tremendous amount of work with the tribes specifically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I look back on my 40 years in archaeology now, and back then in those earlier days, we never consulted with Native peoples. We were the professionals. We were the ones that were experts in the past, and we just didn't see the need for consultation. But what has happened is a paradigm shift where we are now in sync in many cases with the Native community, working together to find common ground. And I think, I could certainly say archaeology has benefited from that, and hopefully the Native community has been able to get something out of that that's very positive in terms of their culture history.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, I know this is, I think, the unfortunate side sometimes, and we've talked a little bit about this on the show, is that for the public, when they think about archaeology, very often they're immediately thinking about ancient Native American cultures, and that being the principal focus. And for a number of us, that it has been where we've spent a lot of time and effort. But one of the things we try to convey in this show is that archaeology addresses a much broader range, not just of time periods, but of different people. And we haven't even cracked open discussions on many of these topics. So there's an entire world of underwater archaeology, maritime archaeology, industrial archaeology. There's a huge range of topics, and 20th century stuff. This is, for many of us who were, let's say, born closer to the mid part of the 20th century, it's a little bit scary sometimes to think about some of the sites that we're looking at now, because they're certainly within the living memory of our parents, if not ourselves. But it's a really fascinating topic. And I know one of the things Brian really wanted to talk about are the sort of Nike missile batteries.
Absolutely.
And Nike sites that are a number of them here in Connecticut. And for folks who are under 40, the Cold War and how important it was in the lives and the thinking and the anxieties of all of us is, and it's remarkable to imagine something so important in our lives fading from memory so quickly. And so these sites, like the Nike missile batteries, really do a fantastic job of conveying just how threatened we all felt. So I think those are examples of sites that we kind of take for granted or we don't think about very often, being really important for remembering our own histories and our own sort of cultural changes over much shorter periods of time.
Yeah, we lose it really quickly. The state of Connecticut gives the Office of State Archaeology authority to preserve and protect archaeological sites that are 50 years old or more. So, that means I'm eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. It's really scary.
But like you said with the Nike site, there was also a site that I worked on. It was a Russian Orthodox church out in Danbury that burned in the 1930s. Yeah. And you think that, well, there's nothing there. But for that community, that church community, us going back and recovering components of what was a church that their parents or their grandparents worshipped at was a really important and a moving experience for them. And it was, it started with, this is not going to be the most exciting day. And it was a really important and a really satisfying excavation process that we took place in a relatively, new site, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the seduction that archaeology presents to many of us, is when you very first start, you do a volunteer excavation or you do your first field school, 99.9% of us are thinking, I really hope I find something cool. And you're thinking that for weeks on end, and you feel jealous when somebody else finds the cool thing. And when we're talking about cool things, mostly we're talking about or broken bits of glass or pottery. These are not cool in the grand scheme of things, but they're remarkably exciting when you first start. And then as you go along, you start gaining an appreciation for completely different facets, and in some cases the most mundane things that trigger recognition for you, and you follow that thread into what is a completely fascinating story that you had no idea you learned yourself about that. And I think it is that, as Scott, as you're saying, it's not the sites that are immediately spectacular that we focus on. The ones that stick with us are the surprises, the ones that start off looking like something you've seen a million times before, and you realize there's an incredible story behind that you would have completely missed had you not had your eyes open.
Well, how seismic was it then? Because I believe you were there. LRB, part of our team, was at Wethersfield, and you were part of that event. And it was at Wethersfield. Her favorite thing was, I think she said it was a gin bottle or something. It was a bottle of booze that she said. So LRB, way to go! It's the person who doesn't drink was excited about a 100-year-old flask of some sort. But that's where we had to kind of rethink a little bit about the landscape of our towns and villages hundreds and hundreds of years ago, because there were pieces of a palisade that were found. You must have freaked out.
It was pretty amazing. I mean, we knew there was 17th century potential there because Wethersfield is such an old town, but to actually find it and to find it so well preserved was really amazing. But the other part about that site that was so cool, and it got a lot less attention because the 17th century component was so mind-blowing, was that we found archaeological evidence of all, 380 years or whatever of the occupation there. And there was this early 20th century deposit that was just full of all these totally bizarre medicine bottles and just household trash. And it was really just, it hasn't been analyzed yet, but the potential to just really grasp early 20th century life in a time period where, patent medicines, and we were kind of on the verge of scientific medicine and quackery and all of this stuff was really, really amazing. And so some of the pictures that came out of that with the press were all of these bottles lined up on the side. And I mean, it was astounding.
But are you literally uncovering a different century, just, a foot below a previous century?
In some parts of that site, yeah, that's the case. In other parts, things are more compartmentalized.
Yeah.
But yeah, that part was really incredible.
It's almost, how do you know when to stop digging?
Archaeologists will usually go until they're threatened with collapse.
Glacial.
Yeah, basically it was glacial soil. I mean, soil that's older than human occupation of our region.
To pick up what Scott was talking about with that Russian Orthodox church that burnt down, what was cool about that was not only what we were finding, like the burnt stained glass windows and parts of crucibles and icons that we were finding that were had been burnt in that process, but we were actually working with the church. We were working with parishioners, and they were getting so excited. And I think that connection it's personal. Yeah. And when it becomes personal, it really heightens, if you want to say the coolness, but I think it really heightens the significance. And so one of the things that I've always found that when you have those sites that have that personal connection, boy, that's powerful.
Yeah, and Nick, that immediately makes me think of the Chesterfield Synagogue, one
Yes.
of our state archaeological preserves in the Chesterfield village of Montville. Another remarkable community, and this incredible history of Central European Jews coming to here in this very elaborate settlement program and taking over Yankee farms that had been abandoned by farmers who moved to the city to work in all of the mills. And that story, the Jewish congregations that were established all over eastern Connecticut in particular, have a remarkable history. In Chesterfield, there were descendants, in some cases actual members of that community, who were still able to help share their stories and really bring that site to life in a way that I think affected every single one of us who worked on it in any way. But more than that, they introduced, at least to me personally, this entire history of Connecticut I didn't know, which is not just Central European Ashkenazi Jews coming here, but also Finns, Germans, Swedes, this remarkable history of immigration that was really specifically geared towards reviving Connecticut farms that had been abandoned and gone to fallow as there were no longer enough people to run those farms. And that's had a huge influence on rural parts of Connecticut. The complexion of the communities that we live in many rural parts of the state really still reflects that very late 19th through World War II sort of immigration wave. And to know that there are threads of their lives that still lurk all over. So in eastern Connecticut, the sauna, right, there's a very large number of Finnish communities, and you see these weird foundations and chimneys and backyards. And if you didn't know what they were, you'd think it was a very small, strange little shed that somebody built. Some dad who wanted to get away from the family built in the backyard. But in fact, it was a very well established pattern, and there were specific sauna makers who built many of these, and the surviving members of that community can tell you exactly who built it, how long it was up, when it burned down, and they almost all burned down at some point. But again, it's that texture, those sort of fine details and the personal aspects of it that really strike me when I think especially about those sort of later, more recent sites.
This in from a listener: are sites ever found by everyday people? Perhaps out for a hike or putting in a new foundation for a garage or something like that? Are you getting tips from the average member of our community?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we appreciate when the public will let us know about artifacts being found, because that helps us understand more with the site and the importance of it. But boy, I can't tell you how many hundreds of sites that people have called in or met and introduced us to because they were working in their gardens or what have you. So absolutely, keep your eyes open, but be sure to call the Office of State Archaeology.
Yeah, what is the protocol? And that is it? I mean, are you the 911 for the I found a something funky in my backyard?
Yeah, I think this. My experience in working with a state archaeologist is they will get a call or an email, and that will set us out on an adventure. As a matter of fact, Brian's first rescue excavation or salvage excavation when he came on was turned out to be a pretty important Middle Archaic site, which we had a floor of a big structure, so like a longhouse kind of a structure floor with some points, and then 24 of these, he called them earth ovens. So, you would dig a hole into the dirt and put hot coals in there, and then you would put tubers, cattail root, and whatever other vegetables you wanted to cook, and you would let them cook there. And that site was found by a gentleman, Ken Horton, was out on his ATV, riding ATVs with his kid, and they saw a construction project had been authorized without review, and he saw these stains on the soil, and he said, that doesn't look right. And Ken Horton and Howard Horton are farmers in South Glastonbury who are really stewards of the land. They've collected, they have an amazing collection of artifacts that have come up their property that they've been farming for generations, and he knew enough that didn't look right. And he called Brian, and we went out there, and we were able to rescue this really interesting, and as we talked about in episodes over the past 11 months, kind of poorly understood time period in Connecticut history in the Archaic period.
Love that.
So, Scott, I want to go back just briefly to last spring again to talk about one of these other sort of things that archaeologists think about all the time, but I don't think is probably in the minds of many of our listeners. And that is, as we go through our process, right, when we talk about site discovery, it is almost never a circumstance where something suddenly pops up out of the ground and we recognize what it is. It's a very labor-intensive, long, drawn-out process. But at some point for typical excavations, an archaeologist has to make a call about whether they think what they're working on is important or not. And you often have very little information when you do this. And so it is a struggle for almost all of us to make the right call with that minimal information. And in particular, where there's a lot of money or important infrastructure that's on the line and that may have an impact. And I think For this past year, the most obvious example of this is what's now the Brian Jones site in Avon, Connecticut, which we talked about last May.
Yeah.
For this, and I know, Sarah, you were working on that. It is can you talk a little bit about that process of, the difficulty of making recommendations and making a call that has a really significant impact for a lot of people from those little tiny bits and pieces of information you have?
Yeah, I mean, it was, this is a long-term project. It started a long time ago, this need to replace a bridge in Avon. And there was a woodland period site that was known that Ken Fader and Fred Warner had excavated in the 80s and 90s. It was on the river, so it was a lot of alluvial deposits, very deep soils. And we went out and did, well, not we, it was before I even worked at AHS when Brian was there. They went out and did a survey, and they didn't find anything. Basically, the little woodland site had been completely excavated. But Brian just had this, feeling that these soils were really deep. He couldn't get to the bottom of them. He just felt in his gut that there was a potential with the landform and the landscape for there to be much earlier and deeply buried materials there. So he made the recommendation. Meg Harper, backed him up. It was kind of a hard sell to DOT, just because the idea of having to strip off 5 feet of soil and find a place to store it and let the archaeologists come in and do their testing, it was expensive. And it was time consuming. We worked out a strategy in the end where we dovetailed it with construction. So the soil that was going to be removed anyways, we kind of did it at that time, and it paid off. We found this incredible Paleo-Indian site. But that was in some ways kind of a gamble.
Yeah. And I think, those of us who've been doing this for a long time have been on the wrong side of that equation more than once. Yep. And it is part of the experience. It is humbling when you really feel, you either have a feeling, you have a conviction that there's something here, and you can spend an enormous amount of time and money to find out you were wrong about that. And, we all try to learn from those experiences, but if we're talking personally about what the experience of being a professional archaeologist is, to me that is fundamental, and you learn over time how to temper your immediate instincts. And I think, Brian was an example of somebody who, when he had that feeling, he chased it, he interrogated it, he thought a lot about it, but he would push hard when he felt there was good reason to do that. All right, everybody, so we're going to head into a brief break, and we'll catch you on the backside.
How do you like this music that we have going on?
This harkens back to the first episode, doesn't it? It does.
On view now at the New Britain Museum of American Art is For America, paintings from the National Academy of Design, featuring over 90 works by members of the National Academy of Design, including Thomas Eakins, Winslow Homer, and Andrew Wyeth, along with masterworks from the Hudson River School and American Impressionism. For more information, check out nbmaa.org. That's nbmaa.org. See more at the New Britain Museum of American Art, where art meets life.
Have you ever wondered what it would be like to step into the mind of a chef? The Essex brings that to life with a forward-thinking menu that explores and reinvents constantly. Hi, I'm Cole Taylor, a Michelin-starred chef, restaurateur, and owner of Los Charros Cantina and the Essex, where I want you to experience modern American cuisine that draws inspiration from the land, sea, and deep heritage of our Connecticut River Valley. Alongside a legion of international flavors, the Essex marks the transition between old New England charm and upscale elegance at an affordable price. a time that calls for refreshment and rejuvenation. Steeped in the rich heritage of our Connecticut River Valley, the land infuses our culinary vision with the freshest locally sourced products available from farm and sea. We call on traditions from around the world as well as the avant-garde to represent both the nostalgic and modern through progressive interpretations of timeless dishes. We are a sustainably driven restaurant with a focus on local products and global flavors. And yes, there is even a speakeasy upstairs, Thursday through Saturday. That would be the Cocoa Club. Visit us at 30 Main Street in Centerbrook or theessex.com. Let us take you on a journey, theessex.com.
Hi, Scott Brady, welcoming you back to Archaeology in Connecticut. Say that 3 times fast. One of the questions that I got, several people have sent in some email questions before the show, and they were curious about what's the future for the Office of State Archaeology. As we all know, Brian passed away this July, and the selection process is underway, but I don't know that all of our listeners are aware that there is a process to select a new state archaeologist. And at this point, that process has come to a conclusion, and I'm very happy to announce that the offer was made to Dr. Sarah Sportman, and she has accepted, and she will be becoming the next state archaeologist here in Connecticut. It's going to be an incredibly exciting time. I think she's the perfect choice and the perfect fit for the job, and I want to congratulate you on the air and let all our listeners know that you are ready to step into the role and hit the ground running.
Yeah, thank you very much.
That's exciting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when do we have a start time? Is there a ceremony? Is there an official? Is there a cutting of a ribbon or something? Is there taking over of an office? Is there a putting up of your personal cell phone information? I mean, what's the protocol?
She has to be taken into the basement of her secret ceremony to talk about
hazing?
How to hide all the evidence of Vikings in Connecticut before she can start her position.
Well, what would happen when Sarah takes over very shortly?
About a week.
In about a week. I'm going to be working with her overlapping for a good month or so, and we'll do some training and give her some institutional history and kind of show her around and get her. But Sarah's been a long-time member of the archaeological community here in Connecticut, so I'm sure it'll be relatively painless. But there's a whole procedure. We want to make sure that as we pass the baton on, that we do so with all of the information we could possibly give her and help.
Well, our listeners certainly aren't going to hold back, so they start with the tough questions. First of all, congratulations to Sarah. Wondering if archaeology is known to be a profession. So we're not like just talking about Connecticut, but in general, a profession made up mostly of men. Or are there just as many women in the pursuit and in the vertical of archaeology?
I think actually for several decades now, there have been a really strong representation of women in anthropology and archaeology. So I guess maybe traditionally people thought of it as a male-dominated field, but I've always worked with lots of women. Most of the companies I've worked for in CRM have been women-owned. So I think there's always been a strong female presence in the archaeological field.
Yeah, and over almost 30 years, I have worked for women my entire career. So to pick up on what Sarah's saying, particularly for cultural resource management, the sort of contract side of archaeology, women are extremely well represented, not just at entry-level positions, but in fact running many of the firms, particularly here in the Northeast.
And I would just add to that, my experience in working in the field with a lot of undergrad and graduate students seems to be predominantly women that I'm getting an opportunity to work with. So I think they are really finding their way even further into the archaeological community and getting advanced degrees and owning companies and doing important jobs and becoming state archaeologists.
Yeah, and several of our neighboring states have had or have female state archaeologists, Massachusetts, New York, and until a few years ago, Vermont. So.
This in from John in Old Saybrook. Is it too early, Sarah? But do you have one goal that you have established as being definitely something you want to accomplish in your first year?
That's a really tough question. I think that there's more than one, but I think the first year in many ways is going to be wrapping my head around the job and kind of getting my feet under me. But I think that a really important thing is to maintain the continuity and really continue the great programming that was started under Nick and Brian with public outreach, updating and maintaining the state's collections and making them accessible to researchers, working with the University of Connecticut to try and get better, more accessible spaces so the collections are in good shape. And for me personally, I've done a lot of Native American archaeology over the course of my career. My background is actually more heavily weighted towards the historic period. So one goal that I really do have and I feel strongly about is working with the historical and historic preservation communities in Connecticut to use archaeology to tell different stories, the more historic period stories, the stories of groups that are oftentimes kind of left out. So, we spend a lot of time thinking about the colonial period archaeology of Connecticut and the Native American archaeology of Connecticut. But archaeology, as it's a perfect lead in what we were talking about earlier, there's so much potential to tell really rich stories about our immigrant communities and our industrial communities, our religious communities, our minority communities. And I think that that's a great way to get more people excited about archaeology and invested in it. So that's a thing that I'd really like to stress going forward.
So let me just see if I'm in sync with you. A good friend of the station's Professor Emeritus at University of Hartford, Wick Griswold, has lectured. You guys know him, I think, and hang out with him. And if there's one person that is worthy of hanging out and having a beer with, it's Wick Griswold. But he spent a lot of time covering the forgotten era in shipbuilding in our area. That everybody's quite aware of the shipbuilding that Essex was famous for in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and certainly the commemoration day and burning of the ships and all that stuff. But when shipbuilding morphed into boat building in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it's something that history just glances over. It's totally, and it's fresher. It's within reach. It's my grandfather's era, but it's a forgotten. Is that an example of how history can come to life a little bit?
Certainly, because when you bring archaeology into the picture, there's a tangible aspect, right? People can see it, people can touch it. I think it really brings that connection in a different way than just sort of reading about something or talking about something. It brings you back, it brings you there, particularly if you're involved in an excavation.
Interesting. We have open phone lines for anybody who wants to call in and serve up a question, 860-526-ICRV. You can also send in a note to info@icrvradio.com. Nick, there was a question that came in. Let me find it. That came in for you. It is Nick, wondering if Nick could tell us about his absolute favorite dig of all time in Connecticut.
Wow, that's a tough one.
Are you allowed to have favorites?
I don't know, but there's probably a top 10, and even most recently, part of that has been breached with the recent find of Revolutionary War burials in the town of Ridgefield that Scott helped me in the FOSA gang helped us work on. I always used to say when people ask me that question, my favorite excavation is the one I'm doing right now because that's the one I'm learning from. But we've had some, marvelous, when I was 30 years ago when I came on board as the Connecticut State Archaeologist, and I think Sarah will learn this by the end of her tenure, is that it never ceased to amaze me how the significance of the sites and the projects that we got involved with. You don't think of Connecticut as the archaeological capital of the world, but we have such an amazing, as this program shows, an amazing archaeological heritage here of so many diverse communities, and you just never know what's going to happen. But no one particular favorite. Probably the repatriations of Henry Opakahia and Albert Afredahawk. To plug my book, are probably help.
Shameless.
Are right up there, but we've done the gamut from vampires to what have you, and it's been all so exciting and so wonderful. I've had a wonderful career, far better than I ever deserved.
So Nick, I know we've asked you a lot of sort of superlatives. Your favorite, your most memorable. You're an endless fount, and you've done so much work that we all have these kinds of questions. But I'm wondering, knowing that the position of the state archaeologist, as we understand it today, largely came out of your own career and you figuring out what a state archaeologist would do here in Connecticut. What do you think is the biggest, unexpected or surprising direction that you ended up going from when you started, when you were first hired as the state archaeologist, to where you ended up?
When we were hired back in mid-1980s, the position was just established by state legislation with mandated responsibilities. And, I knew, here's what we had to do: preservation, collections, work with towns and so forth. But how exactly you did that, and nobody offered us any help. So, just like you say, I kind of invented a process, but that doesn't mean it's the right process, or but this is how it all fell in. What I think, I like to think we worked hard and we had our head down in helping communities like Essex and many of the towns here in the lower Connecticut Valley. But, sometimes, you work so hard, you wonder if anyone's paying attention, if you really are gaining on anything. Are you really saving sites? Are you doing what you really want to do? And then something would happen and you realize it clicks, that the public gets it, and a town planner gets it, and a developer gets it. And sometimes those are the things that have been the most surprising. You just put your head down, you work, you keep at it, and sometimes you think you're not progressing, and then you find out, wow, they are paying attention, and it is getting done. And those are the most surprising things.
One of the things that has occurred to me as we sit here and we're talking about things is, this is almost like a renaissance of just absolute fantastic sites that we're finding right here in Connecticut over the last several years. 4 years ago, everybody was lamenting, well, there are no contact period sites left. And now we have, probably one of the most important Paleo-Indian sites, in my opinion. I think this site, the Avon, the Brian Jones site, will be one of the most important Paleo-Indian sites in the country, based on the material. And, it's a long time coming and a lot of research. But then we have Wethersfield, and we have the Hollister site in Glastonbury. We have John Mason's site in Windsor. And now Ridgefield with our Revolutionary War era. What is going on? Is this just serendipity, or is this a sign that everything's been aligning right for the transition to our new state archaeologist?
Well, I don't know, but I think it's really, it just points out that the sites are there. We sometimes think Connecticut has been so overdeveloped that, there's nothing left, and, there can't be anything below ground that's of a significance anymore, or everything that, needs to be discovered has been discovered. And that's the exciting thing about this science, is it's so open-ended, and there are so many new sites and new ways of looking at sites that are just keep doing it. I don't know if it's a renaissance, but it's a high point, and hopefully it continues. And, there have been periods like that where you get spikes of real certain areas just come to the forefront, certain time periods, certain cultures. But I think it's just an example that there's so much out there, and it needs to be preserved, protected, and learned from.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that's really happening is a real need to revitalize our infrastructure, particularly bridges and things like. There's a lot of projects like that, and a lot of those bridges were built in particular places in the landscape for particular reasons, and a lot of those places are very sensitive for archaeological resources. And older bridges particularly, they weren't built the way modern construction is. It's not scorched earth, blow everything out, scrape it all off. Older construction is really, they've just plopped it down, and everything around it is usually in pretty good shape. So there's a lot of potential in those areas. And when new projects come along and those areas need to be adjacent to bridges, need to be used for staging areas and equipment and things like that, that oftentimes will make them eligible for archaeological survey in a CRM context. And a lot of these sites like Avon are coming out of those types of projects. And I think we're going to see more of that in the future.
Yeah, and I'll point out too, the other important factor, I think, in a lot of this is that we are in the middle of a generational change, right? And so there are a number of us who came up in largely the same sort of with the same academic background, the same thoughts about the past. I mean, we fight, but the general perspective, the way we learned, and the way we taught ourselves to think about the past is a little bit different. And things have advanced, things have changed. And so what we're seeing in Connecticut, and I think what we hope we portrayed on this show over the last year, is that there's an entire generation of younger archaeologists who are taking very different perspectives and questioning a lot of the conclusions that they inherited from the older archaeologists. And that's one of the reasons this show in particular has made me very optimistic about the future, not just in Connecticut archaeology, but the contributions archaeologists from Connecticut are going to make to the broader field. I'm very enthusiastic about the younger generation that we see coming on board now. Just listening to them, understanding their research, it's been very uplifting in many ways.
I think one of the reasons why I enjoy this program is because you guys all have made archaeology kind of a spectator sport where we can be on the sidelines kind of watching the conversation unfold. And it's the little things that I've really enjoyed. And for instance, there was one program where you were talking about, I believe it was a site that was just off of the Connecticut River, Rocky Hill area, I believe, and you were talking about some of the things that you found in, I forget what you call it, the trash heap that's hundreds of years old, but you found a lot of old shells, oysters and clams, et cetera, things that would come, from the sound. And, for me, it's just like, hold on. Let's hit the brakes right now and let's talk about this, because that site, if I don't know exactly where it is, but it has to be 20 plus miles away from actual brackish water, from actual water where you would find oysters and clams, and that's a long distance. And then that just kind of takes on its own life. That one find of an old oyster shell is the portal through which you go on a massive journey of exploration of like how mobile were these communities? How long did they hold on to this food, and why was it still such an important part? 20 miles. How long would it take them to go 20 miles? And set up an encampment. Fascinating stuff. There was one show where you had, I forget this woman. She's so bright. She's been on a couple of times. She's like one of the foremost authorities on First Nation. We were talking about, I remember it came up that where in the find, in the dig, you had a lot of clay pipes, and somebody made the assumption that's like, well, that speaks to the import of tobacco. And she goes, really? Did you find tobacco? I mean, there are other things that you could put in a pipe. So it was like, hold on a second, pump the brakes again. So there's a lot of brake pumping going on, and that's been the most fun for us.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that archaeology can do when it's at its best is remind you. I think sometimes we look on the past and they didn't have cell phones and cars and all the modern things we have, and look at those peoples and think that somehow they didn't have the capacity that we have. And you can see that there's materials that are trading over vast different distances. There's technologies that we struggle with using now that were commonplace then. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember, because otherwise you start looking for other explanations about how ancient peoples did things, or how people even 2 generations ago, what they thought and what they did. And they're the same as us, and they're remarkably ingenious, and they adapt to their landscape and the conditions that they're living in, just like modern people. And it's really important that we teach people that.
This in from a listener. How many people are involved in Friends of the Office of State Archaeology? How many members do you have?
Well, we roughly have about 200 members.
Wow.
So it's a really, it's a great organization. And sometimes those organizations, these archaeological organizations, have struggled over the last, decade or so. but I think in part because of, working with Nick and Brian and their inclusion of FOSA and allowing us to come out and assist and work with us and working with the FOSA people and keeping us informed about what's going on. It's made a great difference in us being able to attract new membership.
All right, so if you guys allow me, because I love hanging out with smart people, and you guys are the smartest people that we know on ICRV Radio. So I get, this is, for me, this is full circle, because I was there at the beginning with Brian, and a lot of people don't realize that it took a year of Brian's actually trying to figure this thing out, whether, what the curriculum was going to be. So while we're celebrating a year of being on air, it's actually 2 years that we're celebrating of us kind of kicking this puppy around. So now I get to have a little bit of fun. I'm putting this to each one of you, and I don't care who goes first, but feel free to jump in. But we have gone back tens and tens of thousands of years on this program. We've gone back 100 years plus, and everything in between. So, if you could, disease-free and with total security, if you could go back to an era that you have learned about through your own personal experiences in this field, what era would that be, and why, and what would you most look forward to doing?
Well, I think for me, I've been really lucky. I've got a chance to work on the Jones site. I've got a chance to work on the Templeton site, two really amazing Paleo-Indian sites here in Connecticut. And again, it's the superlatives, right? The first people here. To me, I think that's what I'd like to see. And the other part of it is what's preserved from those time periods is just the stone. So we have stone tools and we have debris from them making stone tools, but obviously they're using other materials in ways that I'm sure we can't even imagine properly. So I would love to go back and see what that relationship is like with those people in the landscape and how they're moving around and how they're using all the materials around them to survive.
Good answer.
Yep. And I will go with 10,000 years ago for the period right after what Scott is talking about. And to me, what is incredibly fascinating about what we call the early archaic is we know so little about this period, and what we do know seems so contradictory. We get indications that people are moving across the landscape and living very similarly in many respects to their ancestors, the Paleo-Indians. And then we have the complete opposite in other cases, where people seem to be hunkered down in the same place for months at a time and living in pit houses. And we really don't know how these pieces mesh together. In terms of big ticket questions that we might have about a particular period in the past, we're so far short of basic answers for this time period. I think it's one of the greatest for archaeologists, one of the greatest mysteries in the Northeast region, at least.
I think I'm torn between two, but I'm going to go with actually the late archaic period, because I feel like it's one of the periods that's the best represented with archaeological sites across the region. But at the same time, I feel like we don't have a great grasp on what's going on. It's incredibly complicated. It seems like there's a lot of people moving around the landscape. They're interacting in very complicated ways. But to just really get in there and see it and try to, tease some of that out, the things that we can't see here, I think that would be really fascinating.
And I'm going to come closer to us in time and talk about the contact period, that period when Europeans first come to this shoreline from exploration, fishing, and then eventually settling, and the interaction with native cultures that were already established here. I think we have so many, basically sometimes what we were taught in school, so many misconceptions about that time period. That archaeology is the part of the science that could help bring that about and appreciate it. Like the myth of Thanksgiving, what really happened back there, and what the relationship was. The native community was extremely more powerful than the first English that came here until their populations with the Great Migration started to change that balance. But we had the Dutch, who were very powerful in New England, and you had this really three-pronged English, native, Dutch, political, economic sphere that was just so dynamic. It led to conflict, It led to starvations. It led to diseases. There was so much going on. And to get a better grip, to go back and see that time period, what truly, really happened, than the misconceptions I think sometimes taught in schools about, what a lovely place the Puritans came to and so forth. But it's a fascinating time period.
I love the fact that nobody dodged that question.
Yeah. Well, archaeologists are opinionated. I think as we look back now over 11 months, I think it's been a really good ride. I think that the plan that Brian put in place is a really good one. I think we're teaching, or I hope we are reaching a lot of people and getting them interested and fascinated and having them understand there is archaeology in your town. It's not isolated. It's everywhere here in Connecticut. I think that's an important message. I think Brian would be really thrilled that all of you are listening to us talk about archaeology, and I hope that we can teach you something every time we come on the air.
How about letting people know how they can find, follow, be part of all things with the office itself and with the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology? How can people find, follow, and be a part of it? Sure.
The FOSA, we have a Facebook page, so it's Friends of Office Archaeology Connecticut. If you type that in on Facebook, you'll find us. We also have a website, FOSA, FOSA-CT.org, and you can find us either place.
And Sarah, how should people reach out to the office once you've learned the secret handshake and all that stuff?
There's also a Facebook page. We're going to be, I think, probably working on expanding that to other social media platforms like Twitter and Instagram and trying to figure out ways to link those up. There's also websites through the University of Connecticut. The State Archaeology Office of State Archaeology has a website through the University of Connecticut.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this month's show, and we look forward to seeing you again next month.
And Dan, thanks so much for taking the torch when Brian got ill and couldn't continue on.
Happy to do it.
You guys have done a great job.
And congratulations, Sarah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.